Claude responded, I built the cabinets in that kitchen with my own two hands. Every drawer, every hinge, measured twice before I ever cut the wood. I built the cabinets in that kitchen with my own two hands. Every drawer, every hinge, measured twice before I ever cut the wood. At my daughter's wedding, my new son-in-law stood up during the toast and told all 200 guests that I had 30 days to sign my hardware store over to him, or he'd make sure I never saw my grandchildren again. I didn't raise my voice. I set my glass down, walked out of that reception hall, and drove home in silence. 3 weeks later, federal agents were waiting in his driveway when he woke up. My name is Walter Kowalski. I'm 64 years old. Before I tell you what those agents found, you need to understand how a man spends 35 years building something with his bare hands, only to have it nearly taken from him by someone who called himself family. None of what happened that morning was luck. It was set in motion months before anyone said a word out loud. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought your kindness was weakness, stay with me to the end. And if this story means something to you, hit like and subscribe, because there are more stories like this one coming. Now, let me start from the beginning. I opened Kowalski's Hardware on Route 9 outside of Scranton, Pennsylvania in 1989. I was 27 years old. I had a wife named Barbara who believed in me more than I believed in myself, and I had $3,000 saved up from working the counter at somebody else's hardware store for 6 years. Barbara did the books every night at our kitchen table while I stocked shelves during the day. We didn't have much, but that store was ours, every nail and every square foot of it. Our daughter Emily was born 2 years after we opened, and by the time she was old enough to reach the counter, she was already sweeping floors on Saturday mornings for $1 an hour, which she thought was the greatest deal in the world. Barbara passed away 6 years ago. It was ovarian cancer, and it took her fast, faster than any of the doctors expected. After the funeral, it was just me in that house on Maple Ridge Road, the house we'd raised Emily in, the house that suddenly felt too big and too quiet at the same time. Emily worried about me being alone out there, and I understood why, because I worried about it too some nights. So when she told me she'd met a man named Craig Dunmore at a business conference in Philadelphia and that things were getting serious, I was happy for her. I wanted her to have what Barbara and I had. I didn't know yet that Craig had already looked up the store's annual revenue on public county tax records before he ever asked Emily out on a second date. Craig was 36 when he married my daughter, 12 years older than her. Smooth talking, always dressed like he had somewhere important to be, even on a Tuesday afternoon. He ran some kind of consulting business out of a rented office in Scranton, though I never once heard him describe clearly what the consulting actually was. He was polite to my face, complimented my coffee, asked me questions about the store like he was genuinely curious. I welcomed him the way I would have welcomed anybody who made my daughter smile again after 2 hard years of watching her grieve her mother alongside me. I gave him a set of keys to the store so he could pick up paint supplies for their new house without waiting on me. I never once imagined those keys would end up in a locksmith's hands, getting copied without my knowledge 3 days after I handed them over. Within the first year of the marriage, Craig started showing up at the store more often, not to shop, but to linger. He'd stand near the register asking my longtime manager, a woman named Doris who'd worked for me for 18 years, questions about our supplier contracts and our monthly gross. He asked me more than once, always phrased casually, whether I'd ever thought about modernizing the ownership structure or bringing in a partner to help the business reach its potential. I told him I appreciated the thought, but the store had done just fine running the way it always had. I noticed how he talked about the business like a thing waiting to be unlocked, rather than something Barbara and I had bled for. I noticed how he watched the register at closing time, counting in his head. I told myself I was being an old man who didn't trust change. I told myself Emily was happy, and that mattered more than my suspicions. I was wrong to swallow those instincts for as long as I did, but I loved my daughter more than I trusted my own gut, and at the time, that felt like the right way to live. About 5 months before everything came apart, my grandson Nathan, Emily's boy from her first marriage, who I had helped raise since he was 4 years old and who called me Grandpa Walt, like it was one word, came to find me at the store on a Thursday afternoon while Craig was at a meeting downtown. Nathan was 17 then, quiet and sharp in a way that reminded me of Barbara, and he asked if we could talk in the back office. He shut the door behind him, which he'd never done before, and he set a thick envelope down on my desk. "Grandpa, I need you to keep this somewhere Craig will never think to look," he said. I asked him what it was. He told me he'd been helping Craig set up a new laptop a few weeks earlier, fixing some software issue, And he'd seen files he wasn't supposed to see, spreadsheets, emails, documents with my name and the store's federal tax ID number on them. Just trust me, Grandpa. If anything ever happens where Craig tries something with the store, open this first. I laughed a little, told him he'd been reading too many crime novels for a kid his age. He didn't laugh back. He looked at me with something I hadn't seen on his face before, something between fear and a kind of fierce protectiveness that made him look older than 17 for just a moment. I took the envelope without opening it, and I locked it in the small fireproof safe in my office closet, the same safe where I kept Barbara's jewelry and Emily's birth certificate. I didn't ask more questions that day because Nathan looked like a boy who'd already made up his mind about protecting his family, and I trusted him completely. That envelope sat untouched in my safe for 5 months, and I had no idea it would end up being the only thing standing between me and losing everything. It was a rainy Tuesday morning in September when Nathan didn't come down for breakfast before school, and Emily found him still in bed, unresponsive. A bottle of his prescription medication for a heart arrhythmia nearly empty on his nightstand. The paramedics said later it looked like an accidental double dose, something that can happen when a 17-year-old manages his own medication and simply loses track. But there was an autopsy ordered anyway because of his age. Standard procedure, the coroner explained to us through tears we couldn't stop. I remember standing in the hospital hallway holding onto a plastic chair because my legs wouldn't hold me up on their own. Craig was there too, and I remember him putting a hand on my shoulder, his face arranged into something that looked like grief from a distance, but felt hollow up close. Though I told myself that was just my own pain talking, making me suspicious of a man who'd done nothing but stand beside my daughter. The days after are still foggy to me even now. Calling relatives in 4 different states, choosing a casket too small for a boy who should have had 60 more years ahead of him. Emily could barely speak, and I found myself holding both of us up, the way you do when grief hands you a job you never asked for. I kept expecting to hear Nathan's sneakers on the stairs before school. I lost my grandson, and it felt like losing Barbara all over again, like losing a piece of the family we'd spent decades building. I sat in his room one night, surrounded by his model airplanes and his half-finished homework, and I cried until there was nothing left in me. I had no idea that in less than 2 weeks, the man standing beside my daughter at that boy's funeral would try to take the only other thing I had left. The funeral was held on a gray Saturday at St. Casimir's, the same church where Nathan had been baptized 17 years earlier. Nearly 200 people came, teachers from his high school, his baseball teammates, neighbors who'd watched him grow up on our street. I stood near the casket, accepting hugs from people whose names I couldn't remember through the fog of grief. Craig stood close to Emily the entire service, playing the part of the supportive husband with practiced ease. I'll be honest with you, this part of the story doesn't end at the funeral, because the wedding happened only 4 months after we buried Nathan. Emily insisted on going forward with it, said Nathan would have wanted her to have some happiness after everything, and I didn't have the heart to tell her what I was starting to feel in my chest about the timing of it all, about how quickly Craig seemed ready to move life forward. The reception was held at the Scranton Elks Lodge banquet hall. 200 guests, string lights across the ceiling, my daughter finally smiling again for the first time in months. I was sitting at the head table in my good suit, the same suit I'd worn to Nathan's funeral because it was the only one I owned, nice enough for either occasion, when Craig stood up holding a microphone for his toast. He started off charming, the way he always did, thanking everyone for coming, talking about how much he loved Emily, how the last year had taught him what really mattered in life. Then he turned toward me, still smiling that easy smile, and said into the microphone, loud enough for all 200 people to hear, "And Walter, I think it's time we talk business. Don't you? I've been running the real numbers on that store of yours for a while now, and I think it's time you sign it over to me. Let a younger man take it into the future. You've got 30 days to think it over, unless you'd rather I stop bringing Emily and any future grandkids around to see you at all." He laughed like it was a joke, and half the room laughed nervously along with him, unsure if they'd heard him right. But I saw the faces of people who knew me. My old manager Doris sitting 3 tables back with her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. My neighbor Gerald Whitfield choking on his wine. Emily herself going pale in her wedding dress, her eyes darting to me like she couldn't believe what her own husband had just said out loud in front of everyone we knew. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up and make a scene at my own daughter's wedding. I looked at Craig for a long moment, and something inside me went completely still and quiet, the way a pond goes still right before the first frost sets in. I thought about Nathan, about that envelope still locked in my safe, about the 5 months I'd spent trusting a 17-year-old boy's instincts over my own denial. I thought about 35 years of sawdust and long nights, and Barbara doing the books at our kitchen table. Then I smiled at Craig, a real calm smile, picked up my water glass, and said, "We'll talk soon, Craig." That's all I said. I set the glass down gently, stood up from the head table, walked past 200 stunned guests, and out into the parking lot. Behind me, I could hear the low murmur of confused wedding guests trying to figure out what they had just watched happen to a grieving grandfather at his own daughter's wedding. Gerald Whitfield had been my neighbor for 22 years, ever since he and his wife Nancy bought the house next door on Maple Ridge Road. He was 68 now, a retired high school shop teacher, the kind of man who still changed his own oil and split his own firewood. He'd been at that reception, and he'd heard exactly what Craig said into that microphone. When I pulled into my own driveway an hour later, Gerald was standing on his porch like he'd been waiting for me, and he just said, "Get over here, Walter." "I've got the coffee on." Nancy set up a plate of food for me at their kitchen table without me asking. I sat there, and Gerald poured 2 mugs, sliding one across to me before he sat down. "You want to talk about it?" he asked. I told him everything: the 30-day ultimatum, the threat about the grandkids, the way Craig had smiled the whole time he said it, like he was doing me a favor. Gerald shook his head, his jaw tight. "That store is yours, Walter. Always has been. He can't just talk his way into taking it." I nodded, but my mind wasn't fully on the legal side of things yet. My mind was on that envelope, still locked in my safe at the store, the one Nathan had told me to open if Craig ever tried something. That night, after Gerald and Nancy had gone up to bed, I drove to the store, let myself in through the back, and sat alone under the small lamp in my office. I opened the safe and finally opened that envelope. Inside were 4 things that changed everything I thought I understood about the last year of my life. The first was a printed copy of an LLC formation filed with the Pennsylvania Department of State 3 months earlier, called Kowalski Hardware Holdings, listing Craig Dunmore as sole managing member, a company I had never heard of and never authorized. The second was a series of printed emails between Craig and a man named Victor Aldrich, describing himself as a business facilitator, discussing how to use a power of attorney document to transfer ownership of the Route 9 property, once the old man's judgment could reasonably be questioned due to grief. The third item was a printout of my own store's federal tax records and business licensing information that should never have left my accountant's office. The fourth was a note in Nathan's own handwriting, dated the week before he died, that read, "Grandpa, if you're reading this, I found the real files on Craig's laptop when I fixed it. He's been planning this for a long time. Please, please be careful, and don't sign anything he brings you, no matter what he says or how he says it. I love you." I sat at that desk and read that note 3 times, tears running down my face, not just for Nathan anymore, but for the terrible weight that boy had carried alone for months, trying to protect a grandfather he loved. The next morning, while I was still at Gerald's eating breakfast, Craig was already moving. Doris called me around 9 o'clock, her voice shaking, to tell me a man had come into the store claiming to be a transition consultant, asking her for access to the back office and the store's financial records, saying Craig had sent him to start the paperwork early. Doris, God bless her, told the man the office was locked and she didn't have a key, then called me the second he left. What Craig didn't know was that Nathan's envelope had told me exactly where to look and exactly who to call. That same morning, I called an old friend named Frank Castellano, a business attorney who'd handled the store's original incorporation paperwork back in 1989 and who'd known Nathan since the boy was in diapers. I told Frank everything: the wedding, the 30-day ultimatum, the envelope, the mysterious consultant showing up at my store. Frank told me to sit tight, and within 3 hours he called back with news that turned my stomach. He'd pulled the state filing records that morning and confirmed the LLC from Nathan's documents was real, filed using a notarized document that listed my signature as a co-founding member, granting Craig operational control pending incapacity review. The signature on that document was not mine. Frank didn't waste any time once he saw that filing. He'd been practicing law long enough to recognize forged notarization when he saw it. The same red flags, an inconsistent notary seal, a signing date that didn't match anything in my calendar. He tracked down the notary listed on the document, a man named Roy Fenning, and discovered Roy had no actual record of ever notarizing anything for a Walter Kowalski, on that date or any other. Frank suspected, and later confirmed, that Craig had paid Roy, a former associate of Victor Aldrich's, to forge the notarization using an old, unused stamp Roy still had access to from a previous job. Frank explained this wasn't just a family dispute anymore. This was securities fraud tied to a business filing, forged notarization, and attempted financial exploitation of an elder, all federal and state crimes that carried real prison time given the amounts involved. He asked me one question before doing anything further. Walter, do you want to handle this quietly within the family, or do you want this reported properly? I thought about Nathan, about his handwriting on that note, about how a 17-year-old boy had spent the last months of his life trying to protect a grandfather he loved more than his own safety. I thought about Craig standing at that microphone in front of 200 people, smiling while he threatened to take my grandchildren away from me. I looked at Frank and said, "Report every bit of it." Frank filed a formal complaint with the Pennsylvania Attorney General's Bureau of Consumer Protection that same afternoon, along with copies of the forged LLC filing, the false notarization, and Nathan's handwritten note as supporting evidence. By that evening, the case had been forwarded to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division out of the Scranton field office, given the interstate nature of some of Craig's consulting business dealings. The agent assigned was a woman named Special Agent Diane Marsh, a 15-year veteran who specialized in elder financial exploitation cases. Frank met with her personally and walked her through the entire timeline: Nathan's death, the medical examiner's initial ruling, the wedding ultimatum delivered in front of 200 witnesses, and the forged business filing discovered days later. Agent Marsh pulled additional records that week, including the full email exchange between Craig and Victor Aldrich, which detailed a pattern going back over a year, references to at least two other elderly business owners in neighboring counties who Aldrich and his associates had targeted with similar schemes. She also reached out to the medical examiner's office regarding Nathan's death, and something in Craig's financial records, specifically a life insurance policy Craig had quietly taken out on Nathan 6 months before his death, listing Craig himself as a secondary beneficiary through a custodial arrangement Emily never knew he'd filed, raised enough concern that the coroner reopened the toxicology review. Agent Marsh told Frank that between the forged notarization, the fraudulent business filing, and the financial pattern connecting Craig to Aldrich and Fenning, she had more than enough for federal warrants against all three men. 3 weeks after that wedding reception, on a cold Tuesday morning, two black SUVs pulled into Craig and Emily's driveway at 6:15 in the morning. My daughter called me 40 minutes later, sobbing, telling me federal agents had knocked on her door and asked Craig to step outside. Agent Marsh identified herself and informed Craig she was executing a warrant related to fraudulent business filings and financial exploitation of an elderly victim. Emily told me Craig tried to explain that it was all a misunderstanding, that the paperwork had just been preliminary planning. But Agent Marsh calmly informed him that preliminary planning didn't usually come with a forged signature and a paid-off notary. Craig was taken in for formal questioning that same morning, along with Victor Aldrich, who agents picked up separately in Philadelphia, and Roy Fenning, the notary, who was found within the week. Within a month, all three men were formally indicted, Craig facing charges of wire fraud, forgery, and financial exploitation of an elder, with the toxicology review into Nathan's death still ongoing and unresolved as of the last time Agent Marsh updated us. The forged LLC filing was voided by the state the same week the indictment came down, restoring full and sole ownership of Kowalski's hardware back to my name alone, exactly where it had always belonged. Emily filed for divorce the week Craig was arrested, and she moved back into my house on Maple Ridge Road with me for a few months, while everything settled, the same room she'd grown up in, the same house Nathan used to visit every weekend before school let out for baseball season. Gerald and Nancy came by most evenings that fall, and Doris kept the store running steady the whole time, exactly the way she always had. Emily and I went to the cemetery together the week the indictment was announced, and we stood over Nathan's grave for a long time without saying much of anything. I told her what her son had done for us, quietly, over months, without either of us knowing, and I watched something break open in her that had been sealed shut since the funeral. She cried in a way I hadn't seen since she was a little girl, and for the first time since we lost him, it felt like grief moving through her, instead of grief just sitting frozen in her chest. Some evenings I still sit in the office at the back of the store, under that same small lamp, and I think about my grandson. I think about how, even as a 17-year-old boy carrying a fear he never fully explained to anyone, Nathan found a way to protect the people he loved before he ever got the chance to grow old himself. That envelope in my safe wasn't just paperwork. It was a boy's last act of love for his family, prepared months before he could have known exactly how badly it would be needed. I lost my grandson, and no verdict, no indictment, no return deed will ever fill that hole in me. But I got to keep the store we built with our bare hands, and more than that, I got to keep the truth of who that boy really was, right up until the very end. If this story moved you the way it still moves me every time I tell it, do an old man a favor and hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories like this one, and I'll see you next time. Claude responded, "Love doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it's a quiet boy locking away a folder, trusting that one day it would matter." Love doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it's a quiet boy locking away a folder, trusting that one day it would matter. We won't always see the people protecting us, but if we stay steady, honest, and patient, the truth has a way of finding daylight. Hold your family close, trust the quiet ones who watch out for you, and never underestimate what a little foresight and a lot of love can build. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope its gentle life lesson still found a way into your heart.